Let's take a look at loops. Now remember, the purpose of a loop is to cycle through JavaScript statements until a certain condition is met. The first type of loop that we will look at is the while loop. Let's take a look at the syntax for the while loop. First off, you must begin with the word while. That is a reserved word. And then inside of parentheses you present the condition, so very similar to the if conditional. Then you have the block of code that will execute. That can be one or more statements, and that code executes every iteration of the loop, and finally you close with a curly brace. So the two curly braces indicate the block of code which needs to execute. The code will continue to execute as long as the condition for the while loop evaluates to true. As soon as it evaluates to false, it will exit out of the loop. Now there's another loop structure in JavaScript very similar to the while loop. It's not used very often, basically because it accomplishes the same thing that the while loop accomplishes. But I just want to show it to you before we do an example of the while loop. That's the do while loop. And like I said, it works just like the while loop. The only difference is that the code block will execute at least once. So the condition is not checked until the code block has executed. So it begins with the word do, then inside of the curly braces is the block of code to execute. And then there is a while statement and a condition. So the code block executes, then it checks the condition. If the condition is still true, it goes through and executes the code block again and continues to do that until it is false. So the main difference between the do while and the while is that the do while will always execute the code block at least once. The while not necessarily. Now you can accomplish the same thing with both types of loops. There's one more loop we'll look at in a subsequent movie, but these two are very similar, the while and the do while, so I presented them together. Alright, so back to the while loop syntax, because this is the one we're going to do the exercise on. Let's go ahead and open up Sublime. Now what we want to accomplish with this exercise is we want to generate a random number between 0 and 10. And we want to do it until we get a 5. And then we want to print out how many times it took to get to that number 5. Okay? That's a good situation where we would want to use a while loop. So let's first set up some variables. We want to set up a random variable. This is going to contain our random number. And then we also want to set up a counter. We'll use this counter to determine how many times it takes to get a 5 in our random number. And we need to initialize this variable to a 0 because it's a counter for us. We want to start at 0. We've done it 0 times. Alright, let's go ahead and create our while loop. We begin with the keyword while. Then inside of parentheses we put our conditional. And we want that conditional to be while the random number is not equal to 5. Great. And then we put our code. Then we put our curly braces to indicate our code block. Now, first let's assign a number to randnum, a random number to randnum. So randnum equals math.random, and we want to multiply that by 10 because we want a random number between 0 and 10. Okay? Now, as you may remember from the last time we used random in the math object, that it presents a decimal number between 0 and 1. When we multiply that by 10, there still is a number of digits after the decimal point. So how do we get rid of that? You may remember that we have to round it. Now I could do a second line here But instead, I'm just going to put the results of math.random multiplied by 10 inside math.round. So open parenthesis there, and then I put a closed parenthesis after the 10. That will round the results of math.random times 10. Okay? And now one last thing we need to do is we need to increment our counter. Remember the increment operator, plus plus, that will add a 1 to it. That is exactly the same thing as counter equals counter plus 1. Okay? Both of those would work. Obviously, counter plus plus is shorter to type. All right, now we simply need to print out our results. So let's do a console.log. So basically, once random equals 5, it will exit out of the loop will stop, and then we can go ahead and print out our results. So while the loop is running, counter is incrementing each time it goes through an iteration. So counter will indicate how many times it went through that before it got to a 5. So let's print that information out. Console.log. And just for the sake of giving another example of template string literals, let's use that to print out the data. So I'm going to do a backtick. It took, and then we'll put in the counter variable, because this is how many times it took. To reach, and now let's put in the random variable. We'll just use that variable because then we can make sure that random is set to 5 if we want it to be set to 5. Okay? And then it will conclude that with one more backtick. And the statement needs to be concluded with a semicolon. All right. Let's take a look and see how this works. So we're going to go ahead and save this. I'm going to grab the file path to my HTML file, and then we'll put that inside of the browser. Let's go ahead and open up the console. And this time it said it took 3 times to reach 5. All right, let me dock the console so we can try to execute this a couple more times. It took 3 times to reach 5. If I refresh, we get it took 39 times to reach 5. Refresh again. Took 19 times to reach 5. Okay, I want to make one more change on our code here to make it a little more reusable. So right now, the code is set up to only do this if we want to find the number 5. How can we make this so that it could be any number we wanted between 0 and 10? Well, we could set this up in a variable. Once again, another reason for a variable. So let's call this variable end value, and let's set it equal to 5. Whoops. Then we can change end value anytime we want. Now obviously in this small bit of code we have here, it'd be just as easy to change end value as it would be to change this number. But if we were doing a large program and we had our variables at the top, and who knows how many times we were using that variable, that would be a situation where you'd want to change the variable only, and it would change it for the rest of the program. Just an example of that, we can put end value, and then we could also have end value in our console.log statement. So then we use the variable twice. We only need to change it once up here. Okay, let's go ahead and save that. We'll jump out again, test it. 20 times, 52 times. Just kind of interesting to see this one time. Wow. All right, so there's our first example of a while loop. We're going to do one more example in the next movie.